مارتن غريفيث، دبلوماسي بريطاني والمدير السابق للشؤون الإنسانية في الأمم المتحدة. ولد في 3 يوليو 1951 في كولومبو، سريلانكا. اشتهر بوساطته في النزاعات العالمية وقيادته لجهود الإغاثة الدولية حتى تقاعده في عام 2024.
So let's start with the big picture. After the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, how do you see the Middle East now?
Well, I'm not sure that it's, despite all the claims that we've all heard, safer now than it was before. I'm not sure that we know the truth because there's so many counterclaims about whether or how much the nuclear project in Iran has been set back. I think there's a possible convergence of interest to kind of keep that quiet and in the shadows, because it's good to create a win, you know. US and Israel love getting that win. Iran presumably also wants to keep it in the shadows because they don't want to be bombed again in case it hasn't actually succeeded, as even the Pentagon has said it hasn't, let alone IAEA. So I think we're dealing with a very shadowy public rhetoric on this. And if that's true, which I'm sure it is in different ways, then we're in trouble. Because, as you know better than me, Ibrahim, this is all about then the wider waves throughout the Middle East, because that's how it's being used. It's not just about Iran. It's about the region, with so many appallingly divergent interests. So I think very glad to stop the war. Obviously, that's fantastic because I was in Doha, by the way, when it started, and everybody where I was worrying about the contamination of the sea and the water. We were all hoarding water bottles, right? And so it was kind of an immediate sense of the situation. But no, I'm the jury's out, I think, for me.
But does that mean that we are back to the shadow war or the direct war or confrontation between the two countries will remain?
I think that's a really central question, and people aren't asking enough. Obviously, you are, because I think there's two alternatives, but it's never quite as clear as black and white as two alternatives. But broadly speaking, and it's always the truth in war, that you have one alternative in which this kind of proceeds because there's a mutual interest between the parties, despite the truth to the contrary, what we've just been discussing, to make good about it, and then to move on to the region in the various different ways I'm sure we discuss. And there's the other, which is about, and President Trump did say, didn't he, I'd bomb Iran, absolutely, I think was his words. And I think Netanyahu said the same in the case that we see, progress of the nuclear project. In that sense, I'm not clear whether the absence, the enforced absence of the IAEA is a convenience, because of course I believe in them. I mean, I'm from the UN originally, that they will tell us the truth about what happened. So it's slightly a question for me as to why they've been excluded. I know about the background and stuff like you do. So I think, to get to your precise question, despite all the ambiguities and opacity of this settlement and this ceasefire, and despite the fact that it's obviously a welcome anyway, because it was so dangerous, we don't know which of these paths will happen. Will it be a stabilizing moment for the region, or will it be an encouraging moment for further domination of the region? And we know who we're worrying about domination.
I was talking the other day with someone who you would know about the Middle East. We were talking about the new Middle East after this war. And he reminded me of something. He said, look, Ibrahim, because I know him, for 30 years. He said, look, we've been knowing each other for 30 years. How many times, how many books did we read about the new Middle East? How many articles, how many researches have we done or read about the Middle East? And we always wrong. So
Yes.
where are we now? Where are we now? Do you think we are really in new Middle East is emerging out of this?
I think that's a wonderful expression of the problem. All the books we've read about grand plans, the Grand Compact, the future. History is always full of these grandiose schemes, isn't it? I don't believe it in the Middle East, although I've been seduced by it, as you're saying you have, by specific ideas. The Abraham Accords, of course, is the current one, isn't it? But I'm unconvinced by the notion that there is suddenly a clear blue sky, that now there will be a whole new sense of companionship and leadership, and that suddenly all the oppositions, the enmities that we have seen, which still remain and are unresolved, that at least we know, will somehow go away because of this great sweep of power and influence by great powers, including, of course, Israel, but also the US, and then in a sense equally the European Union, which is clearly on a certain side. So I'm not convinced about that. I don't think it's a grand plan for the Middle East. I think it's much more important and interesting to see it in segments, like what's going to happen in Syria, your country. Where is Gaza going to go in terms of governance? What will be the progress or not towards a two-state solution now that Saudi is, thank God, fully involved in it, but Israel isn't, and I'm not sure where the US stands. And where that meeting, of course, was classically postponed as a result of events, which was an interesting instance. So I don't think so. I think it's a piecemeal thing, which is much more difficult to manage when it comes to suffering.
But to be fair, now this time there's something different from the past, the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Which is we have Trump in the White House.
We do indeed.
And he said it several times. He wanted to impose peace by force.
Yeah.
As you know, he promised to solve three big issues like Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran. But it seems that after a few months, none of them be solved.
No, because it's so much more difficult than we imagine. God knows, Ibrahim, you and I, we've been through this. So wars are always more difficult to end than wars are to start. I mean, that's the basic premise here, isn't it? But the truth is also, and I think you're right to say there is something different. You have a very energetic president in the White House who wants to achieve end of wars, who's publicly labeled his administration as being tied to those objectives. All this talk about the Nobel Peace Prize and so on. And he is very deliberative about this. He's also a bit erratic, but he's deliberative. So where does that leave us? I think, in a certain sense, we're lucky to have President Trump because he's an actor. He is not only an observer. That's always good in ending wars. We always talk about the lack of political will. There's no lack of political will. There may be a lack of political direction. That's a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is missing from this, actually a grand scheme in a certain way, isn't it, is a certain sense of reality and the likelihood of his policies and his allies' policies being convincing. I mean, for example, the idea that Gaza can be turned into a place of defenestration, of a deportation of these humanitarian cities that we're now hearing about, clearly illegal at the very least, isn't convincing in terms of real likelihood of it working. And it'll lead to great controversy, and the states in the region will, of course, rise up against it. So with all President Trump's fervent desire to make peace, I don't question his motive on that. I question his motive on how to do it. And to get, to make the Abraham Accords, for example, the central proposition of peace in the Middle East, doesn't seem to me other than a slightly skewed notion of what's going on in that region.
I'll come back to the Abraham Accords. But speaking about Gaza,
Yeah.
Trump, I think you made a statement a few weeks ago. I think you co-authored an article which all made a lot of noise.
Yes, sorry.
which is like this is always normal from you. And you described what's happening in Gaza as genocide.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And,
Why is it genocide?
well, it's genocide because it is genocide. I mean, it's genocide because what we're seeing is the destruction of a whole population, the destruction of their potential for reproducing and continuing their existence, the destruction of their homeland and their expulsion from it. I don't think there's any doubt, that's why I said it, of course, that this is the reality. Lawyers can argue over this until there's a legal assessment. Of course, that will be the last word. But I felt it's important, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not in the United Nations, to say what is true to the facts on the ground that I and my community, which is the humanitarian community, see. And it is this scapegoating of Palestinians. And, so many of whom are then described as Hamas officials, despite evidence to the contrary. There's been all these claims by Israel including from UNRWA, you remember, right at the beginning of the war, as being part of the, October the 7th actors. No evidence adduced to that. No independent inquiry. So I felt it was important at that point, and actually I am a lawyer, is to say it is what it is. Ibrahim, you'll love this. There's a phrase in law, and I know it as a lawyer, it's a British barrister, called res ipsa loquitur, which basically says, you surely know it, which basically says the thing speaks for itself. It's about reality. So I don't think there's a question about this. Courts will decide, accountability will come, but we need to understand what we're facing.
And you made a lot of noise as well, the way you described GHF.
Yes, did I?
Yes, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
Yes.
It seems that you're not you're not very happy with what they're doing, and why is that?
Well, there's two reasons, I think. There's a personal reason, which is that they have traduced and undermined the principles that I have abided by in my professional work most of my life, which are humanitarian operations. I started, 4 decades ago, dealing with the Khmer Rouge in a complex emergency in Cambodia and Thailand. The Khmer Rouge were hardly, kindly people, as you know. And I've dealt with that sort of stuff ever since. And we in my community, which, until last year I led, have, learned very difficult lessons. And these are lessons which GHF is simply ignoring. For example, you do not lure people into a killing zone, and it is a killing zone. I mean, there's these reports, as you know, about whether the employees of GHF have been asked to shoot to kill. I don't know if that's true or not, because nobody investigates this stuff. Certainly the IDF doesn't. A lot of reports about the IDF zone, shoot to kill or shoot to shoot orders. But in any way, it's a terrible way to undermine the provision of needed supplies for people who are desperately in need and are starving to death. You can't do it this way. And it is directly coming from one of the parties. I mean, this is not a joint Israeli-Palestinian operation. This is not an independent UN or INGO, operation. This is something which has been funded, created, and supported by one party. I don't even need to take account of which party is right. We know that we don't support this. We see the consequences. What if 400 or 500 people now killed in this zone? And just as importantly, Ibrahim, for somebody like me in my profession, there's no monitoring of it. They push the bags out. These poor people from Gaza have to tramp up and down the strip to get there. In this blistering heat, they drag a sack if they're lucky to get it without being wounded or hurt or worse. And then, of course, they're looted on the way back. And there's no real monitoring to say what's happened to all this food. There's a lot of claims, of course, by GHF about we've distributed so many millions of meals. Fine. You couldn't get away with that in normal humanitarian delivery. Because people would ask, donors all over the world would ask, yes, but how many of them went to the people in need who most desperately needed them? How many went into the black market? How many were looted? How many were traded by the, as I say, the black market? So for all these reasons, firstly, this is a terrible example of the compromise of humanitarian delivery. And of course, it gets worse because we think, don't we, Ibrahim, that in any ceasefire that may come, and I think it's an issue now, isn't it? What will the relationship between GHF's operation, now given $30 million by Washington, thank you very much, and the international operation of the UN and others?
It seems this is, by the way, one of the sticking issues in Doha negotiations, because it seems that Hamas is they're not very happy with the whole way humanitarian aid is being conducted. I think this is one of their demands. Speaking about humanitarian aid, this is part, as you said, part of the negotiations on ceasefire. But the ceasefire, the whole ceasefire, is part of a much bigger.
Yes. Yes.
Is it? And where are we at when it comes to the political level, the political horizon, and the two-state solution?
You know, we've seen the movie before, haven't we? When that January decision came in for that, you know, perfectly well-constructed ceasefire leading through 2 or 3 different phases to an end of war and a withdrawal of forces and, you know, a Palestinian hope for their own place in the world and eventually two-state. And it was stopped after the first phase. What a surprise, right? I mean, none of us were surprised by that. And therefore, it would be absurd to think that this is going to do anything different. The first 60 days, mind you, which is extremely welcome and important, but just because of survival of people in Gaza through aid, never mind exactly how the aid has got to them. We fear it will end. Hamas fears it will end. Anybody would fear it will end at the moment when it becomes conclusive and we deal with the future of the Palestinian people. And we deal with their governance rights and their self-determination rights and their security rights. And we deal with the issue of the Riviera or deportation. I have seen nothing, I don't know if you have, nothing reassuring on that. In fact, we've seen the opposite. I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu should ever be blamed for being unclear about his objectives. He's very clear about it, and he's been clear in Washington, you know, as you know, this last week. The continuation of the war to eliminate Hamas, the continuation of a very interesting and illegal, effectively illegal scheme to deport Gazans from their homeland, and so on. We've yet to see the conclusion, but what I fear, boiling it down, is that this, you know, there's a reason to get it because it's humanitarian and safe, and for God's sake, let the people eat. And there's another reason politically, which is let's have a deal, and we know where that goes. But it's not a peace deal the way it stands. Unless it's elaborated more clearly, it's not a peace deal. It's about time we had a peace deal, not just a pause. This is a pause, potentially. And I'm interested by the fact, as I'm sure you are, by the fact that in the drafts, we see President Trump specifically labeled as the guarantor of this moving on through the phases, right? Well, I'd love to see that happen. And I, you know, who am I to question whether he will put his full force behind it? But if he did, we'd be lucky.
As you mentioned just earlier, the Saudis, I think the Norwegians and the French were leading on the two-state solution initiative. And it was, you know, they were supposed to have a big meeting in New York 17th of June.
Yeah.
It's been postponed because of Iran-Israel war. I mean, where are we on this track? What do you expect? What do you see in the upcoming weeks and months on this?
You know, I've been back and forth on this in my head over these 21 months of war, as I'm sure we all have, you have too. Because there's this strident call and belief from many quarters that we have to counter, which is that, of course, it's a nonsense to think of a two-state solution. This is not going to happen. Israel is very clear about that. Others, realists, so-called, will say that's not going to happen. The interest from the region, Saudi Arabia is a great hero on this, by the way, I think. I mean, they have stayed firm in their desire for a two-state solution. Originally, as I understand it, you know better than me from King Salman himself, who was passionate about the rights of Palestinians. So we have a region which is, you know, complicated on the matter. We have a strong level of public opinion in Washington and Israel that it's a nonsense. And yet we listen to that stuff and we think, so what's the alternative? Is any prospect of mutual security going to work without it? I don't think so. If Israel wants to be safe, I'd like Israel to be safe, we all would, but it's not going to be safe without mutual security, right? I mean, we learn that everywhere in the world. So the idea of just making security based on buffers and deportations is against history because of that. And I think we need to keep going. I hope that meeting is to reconvene, but it looks a bit, you know, I hope the Gulf and Saudi Arabia in particular will stick hard to their positions on that, because we can't give that away just casually like that. Anyway, it's against the charter. I mean, it's against the right of self-determination of peoples.
We just mentioned deportation. Just one last thing on Gaza. Deportation, yeah. And we heard several different numbers. We heard some people are talking about expelling some, like, I don't know, 300, 500, 1 million from Gaza to different countries. They're talking about, I don't know, Sudan, Somalia, and even like Syria was mentioned. Like, do you think that is a realistic plan?
I think it's illegal for a start. I mean, it's unequivocally illegal. But perhaps more nuanced and interesting, and we've seen comments about it in the last few days, including, I think, from very interesting comments from human rights lawyers and academics in Israel on international law, saying that so-called voluntary emigration, which I think is what Israel is, you know, focusing on, and God knows.
I think Netanyahu said yesterday that we're not going to force anyone to leave, but voluntarily they can do it.
And you know, who wouldn't want to do it, frankly, at this point? But as these people have said, and I think it's worthy of a lot more commentary and study, it makes sense anyway, is that you can't really imagine a voluntary decision by Palestinians to leave at this point, because of the fact that they're bombed, they're deported down to different parts of the Strip. They're not given any option. You remember this humanitarian cities thing is about taking them in there. They've only got one way out, and it's, you know, abroad. That's not voluntary by any kind of references by refugee or migration laws. So while I think it's right, and it should have been much more exercised before, the right of people to decide their future elsewhere, and it's one of the problems certainly in Israel, but also to some extent in Sudan, that they didn't have that right. You know, they had to pay so much to get out of Gaza and so on. Now it seems a convenient argument, which is actually contrary to essential facts about the protection of civilians and effectively law. So it's a muddle. I think it's a muddle. If there was real conviction to allow really voluntary departure and voluntary staying, we'd have a real conversation with the people of Gaza about it. And we wouldn't be, you know, talking about that from the White House or Tel Aviv. We'd be talking about the people themselves. I don't think we're seeing that yet.
But for me to make sure that I understood you correctly, so you think that is possible, like voluntary people voluntarily can the people leave Gaza? Some people.
No, I don't. I think the circumstances are so specific and so kind of self-evident and common sense. They're moved forcibly. Have been done 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times already.
Yeah.
They're told clearly, you can go if you want, but you can't stay. This whole cats thing about the humanitarian cities is so brutally clear. And so I think it's very, very difficult. You know, I don't have enough facts, and I'm hardly a lawyer, but it's very difficult to come to the conclusion that this is genuinely voluntary. And if that's what is needed, clearly it should be needed, that assessment for such a program. It needs to be done independently and internationally, just like it is everywhere else. You know, we have refugee protocols and so forth. Both UNRWA and UNHCR can do those things to make sure that it's not just a claim of a party which has an interest in deportation or exit, but it actually is a genuine
will by the people.
Properly monitored. Yeah.
I will cover two issues file and then two issues, and then that will be one
Okay.
Syria and then Lebanon. So, speaking about Syria, you mentioned at the beginning when the Iranian-Israeli war started, you were on Doha.
Yes.
I remember well. I mean, when Assad regime collapsed, you were on Doha as well. Maybe you should not go to Doha very often.
It's very true. It's very true, isn't it? My salvation lies in Doha. Doha, the new Geneva.
So speaking about Syria, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, you know Syria well. You've worked on Syria well. So, how do you see Syria now after the collapse of Assad regime, 7 months after the collapse of Assad regime?
Well, first of all, and as you know, Ibrahim, I met Assad quite a few times in 2023. We had this, what seems now like a surreal conversation.
I remember you told me about it. Remember?
I told you, didn't I? And he said to me once, towards the third time, he said, "Don't worry, Martin, I got back into the Arab League. It's all fine, no pressure." And I said to him, I hope I said to him, was that's not good news, Mr. President, because that way lies, you know, perdition. And indeed, he proved his truth by eventually, because he just, you know, despised dialogue and he hated the Turks and this and that.
And I remember he told you, if I'm not mistaken, he told you like right when you asked him about Idlib, he said it's not my problem, it's Erdogan problem.
He says it's a Turkish problem. They'll sort it out. They'll take these people out and they'll send them to some other country. I remember that. I mean, I said, and I'm not like you, I don't know the subject, but even I said, "Are you sure that's good?" And bingo, right, in December. So I'm actually one of those people, contrary to all my activities and profession and history, thinking that HTS march on Damascus was a finally good thing, because we were getting nowhere. The UN was getting nowhere. I was getting nowhere with Mr. Assad.
Arab normalization getting nowhere.
Arab normalization getting nowhere. And, you know, the people were just being, God knows, you went to jail. I mean, you know, being thrown into these places and killed. You know, we always said, you and I have often discussed it, that in a sense, one of the most brutal tragedies of the Syrian 12-year war was the detention without trial or notice of so many people from every family, almost. There were people in these terrible jails, which are now revealed. Assad, I once asked him, by the way, I said, why don't you, as a first step towards a great new future for Israel, for Syria under your rule, why don't you empty the jails? He said, no, I've emptied them. No, it's fine. You know, we've done that. Tell me what more I need to do. So therefore, I think, contrary to my sort of pacifist mediation shtick, that the HTS march on Damascus was necessary.
I think that you were I don't know, but you were supposed to meet Ahmad Shara when he was right?
Do you remember that?
Did you meet him
Yes.
then, or you did not?
No, I tell you what happened. Very good memory. It was after the earthquake, and I wanted to apologize to him, of course, as was publicly demanded. I did do a public apology about lack of aid going into the Northwest. So I said publicly, I think, didn't I? I said, I want to meet Mr. Al-Jilani. And And I'm sure he was saying yes. And then one of the permanent members of the Security Council said, no, 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 he's a terrorist and you can't meet him, appealed to the United Nations, and I wasn't able to have that meeting, which is still a great grief to me because it's against the principles of humanitarian engagement anyway.
Mhm.
Being a terrorist is not the point. And anyway, so what I did have, and I'm sure this is not revealing anything, was a discreet conversation with his now foreign minister, who came to see me. God bless him. So, but I didn't get to see the man, which I think was a stupid error.
But now Al-Shara is not designated as terrorist,
No,
at least in the US law, and but
yes,
still in the UN, I think, and you are not in the UN. So
yeah.
now you can meet him, no? Are you planning to go to see him?
I'd love to go to see him. I'm hoping to go to see him later this month in July, in the third week of July, the week of the 22nd. For a couple of reasons, but also because you are Syrian, Ibrahim, but I've worked there a lot, and I think there'd be something to do. And this goes to the heart of your first question, which is that my view, with all the doubts, I think genuine and proper doubts of many, many Syrians around the country as to what really is going to happen, and the minority rights. I'm always in touch with the Kurds, as you can imagine. We can't, he mustn't fail, because we cannot please see Syria falling back into the internal conflict and disputes that has dominated so far. But he will only succeed if he actually takes some advice, of course. And that is about two things, I think. It's about three things, maybe. But it's first of all about making sure that the sequencing of transition is inclusive, not sequential. So yes, security and stability is the first priority, as we know, but you cannot have that without inclusion. It's not just a security issue. It's not just a stabilization issue. The issue of the Kurds, the SDF coming into the defense forces of Syria, which is a good thing and a necessary thing, is not divorced either from their maybe overstated claims for devolution and identity, and the ones that we see in different ways around the country, as you know. So I think what Mr. Al-Shara has as a huge challenge, and it's not unusual, every place going through these revolutionary processes. Go back to France in 1789 and what happened there. What he has facing him is the extraordinarily difficult task of, number one, stabilizing the place, but stabilizing it politically as well as in security terms. Therefore, managing the incursion into his country of both Israel and Turkey. Turkey being, obviously a key ally for him, which is good from the past. And thirdly, the economy.
Mhm.
Because as we have always observed throughout my time working in Syria, every year people got poorer in Syria since 2012, didn't they? And lifting sanctions is essential. It's very belated. I raised this with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, about Syrian sanctions 2.5 years ago. I said you should make them more an incentive than a punishment. But there was no action at that time. So you've got to lift them, and thank God the US is good on that. But it's difficult to make it work in practice, isn't it, in terms of actual deliverance? So yes, I think he needs to succeed. I think he's very impressive. Of course, people worry about his background, but we have him, and Syria has him, and more importantly, the region has him.
Mhm.
It's the effect on the region as much as anything else.
You mentioned the Kurds. I'm sure you heard that there was a meeting between SDF and the government yesterday in Damascus. So,
Yeah,
but it seems that it did not go very well.
no, no, I think that's it. So as I've heard it too, but your information is better than mine. I think the challenge here is, and I've heard a lot from both the Kurds and indeed from the authorities in Damascus, is the conundrum. and I think it's a genuine one, but it can be sorted, which is, the Kurds don't want to give up their en bloc integration into the armed forces, and Damascus doesn't want to let them do that, because if they're available en bloc, they can jump out any minute. And I know Turkey, I've spoken to, the leadership in Ankara a couple of months ago, understandably worry about that, because they think it's a placebo, a replacement for potential renewal of PKK activity, who's, by the way, also yesterday or the day before laid down their arms. So it's understandable that you need that, but the Kurds, we know, mediated between the PKK and Turkey all those years ago. They need reassurance. Every other minority does too. It's not one against the other. Every other Syrian, I guess, you're in the front line on this, would want to know that their identity and their rights would be guaranteed, not just their security. You can't do it one by one. You have to do it as a package. And that's the worry, I think, both of the Kurds, but anybody else in Syria. But this can be overcome. I think this is just difficult because, I think Mr. al-Shara has a great personality and charisma and record, actually, now. But we must do everything we can to help him succeed.
I hope you will succeed. What about the other big question, the elephant in the room, the Abraham Accords?
Sorry?
Abraham Accord, that you
mentioned. Yes.
And we all know, I mean, it's not secret. I mean, even the White House, in the official statement after Trump Shara meeting in Riyadh on 14th of May, they said he asked Shara to join the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
And the Damascus, I mean, the Syrian government, they're saying, look, the priority is for deconfliction and to implement 1974 disengagement agreement. Your view, what do you think of this?
Well, I'm reminded, this is a bit of a distraction, but I'm reminded when I started work as the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, we remember those times. And I remember my first visit to Riyadh, where I met, senior Saudi officials very much involved in Yemen's intelligence, diplomacy, and the defense ministry and all these. And one of them said to me, a very experienced, very impressive man, he said, there will only be peace in Yemen with trade. What we have to do in Yemen, apart from stopping the war and getting a bit of human rights into the constitution and governance and so forth, is to ensure that there are trade links, which guarantee stability. And I never forgot that clearly, and it's still not yet to happen there, but it's sensible if you can get away with it. And I think this is the Abraham Accords sort of basis, isn't it, for its argument, or the US argument about it. What's missing from it is, in the discussion about it, as far as I can see from my perspective, is that yes, but trade also follows values. Trade follows interests. So it's not simply a matter of establishing trade links and economic openness and whatnot. It's also a matter of alignment of interests. And I fear, for example, it's not simple. And Saudi Arabia is presumably the first kid on the block on that one to talk about this issue, and they have done already, haven't they? They have done forever. I remember back in my day in Yemen, they turned it down because of this lack of aligned values and interests. But yes, it would be good, but it's difficult. The worry for Mr. al-Shara, I guess, and you would know better, is that if he were to go and shake the good hand, as is now promised, of the Israeli leadership, as is promised this September in the US, he needs to take his people with him. And there's been decades of this anxiety and suspicion, not wrongly. So you can't do a trade deal without a political deal. That's the essence of it, isn't it? And to make it just a trade deal is simplistic, and it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked actually. You know, it's Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, wasn't it? Essentially in the first round, good start, but it doesn't change the price of bread. And so, yeah, I think trade is essential, but what needs to happen before that is not a grand compact where we started earlier, right? But it's discussion on what are we signing up to? Are we signing up to trade, or are we signing up to something else? And of course, the truth is they're signing up to not just trade.
And I think there's one big difference, but you know it better than me, that one big difference between Syria and Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Morocco. I mean, you have some differences. One is that you have the Golan, you have occupied territory.
Yes. Yes.
And you have as well, you have some like the buffer zone, Haramon, the mountain of Haramon. Some areas already been captured after 8th of December as well. So you have disputed areas.
Yeah.
Syria is neighboring country, as you said, that you have this history between Syria and Israel.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you really can.
I don't know.
I don't think if you can really do Abraham Accords with Syria, because maybe you need to do something different, to be more creative when it comes to Syria, and to do something. Maybe you would call it Abraham Accords, but it should be different from Abraham Accords.
I totally agree, and it's the focus on the fix, on the deal here that I think is distracting, because just like we have the same experience, just like in every other effort to reduce tensions and increase peace and stop wars and stuff, which is about international diplomacy and mediation, God knows what else. It's all about starting carefully and being gradual. And that's what you're describing, I think, in the Abraham Accords. Of course, it would be lovely to end up with a free trade zone for the Middle East, as it were. Brilliant. Everybody would benefit. But you can't do it. Look how difficult it's been elsewhere. Look how difficult it was in Europe. Look how difficult it was with Brexit. You can't do it without an understanding of what it implies and the consequences. And the popular view, as you said about Syrians, they're still occupied by Israel in parts of their country. That's got to go. So if there's any movement towards, and I don't think it's predicted, any movements towards even Syria signing up, which I think is unlikely in the short term, you've got to deal with that problem and Turkey's problem. And Syria has to be its own independent state, which makes decisions, doesn't it?
Yeah. You worked in Yemen. You worked in Yemen like many years ago.
Yeah.
But you still, I'm sure you still follow Yemen very closely.
I try.
And I'm not really, I know nothing about Yemen. Tell me.
You tried that one on me before.
Tell me, how do you see Yemen now?
Well, I think it's an opportunity and a threat because, I was just reading today about the tax on shipping again in the Red Sea. They've gone back to that. We both know Ansarallah very well. I met Abdul Malik al-Houthi frequently when I was the UN envoy there. So we understand the psychology of the Ansarallah movement and the Houthi movement. And so it comes as no surprise to us that they saw their role in the Gaza conflict as being one that they should join as a belligerent against Israel. I mean, that's kind of what they do. What I thought was fine, unhappy, killing global trade is never a good thing in my view, and so forth. Stop bombing the Red Sea, it's a free trade zone in itself. And I had hoped, and I'm sure you closely watching this, that up until the moment of the war with Iran, that we were seeing a new direction for Yemen, right? We were seeing, partly because of the détente or the entente between Washington and Riyadh, that there would be a return to the sort of common sense experience that we all had, which is that Saudi Arabia is a very, very effective negotiator and engagement with the Houthis. We saw that in the 2018-19 when there were these back channels and so forth. Not to say that Saudi Arabia is greatly liked in Yemen, but it's kind of it's the neighborhood, and they understand each other, and they're both very powerful based people. So it would go back to Saudi Arabia rather than the world bombing, you know, useless places in Yemen, to put this in order. And I was a big fan of that. And I was also aware from my own contacts that this was something which was beginning to be welcomed by the Houthi leadership, tacitly. Well, you know, they're very suspicious. Of course they would be. Saudi's their enemy, bombed them all these years. But it was, you know, it was more interesting than the US sort of overhead stuff. And then the Iran war started. We got lots of signals out of Sana'a and Sada about the potential for this being a route back to the ceasefire, and then trade, of course, and inclusion. And that there wasn't even an insistence at the beginning that bombing of Israel would have to stop immediately. So there was a very wiser approach. Then the Iran war started, as you know, and this was all thrown up in the air. And of course, the Houthis, completely understandably, you know, took their opportunity to bomb more, and vice versa. So we saw this threatened. Now, what I'm really interested in now, and it's very immediate, is whether the resumption to that momentary glimpse of not quite a détente, but a reduction of US involvement and increase of Saudi leadership could lead to something that we all saw a little bit of glimpses about when I was there. I'd hope so. It's not unresolvable. People overstate, I think, we talked about this often in the past, Iranian influence. Ansarallah is certainly sees Iran as a major ally, but it's also a nationalist, Yemeni, imam-based, imam-led movement of you know, confident nationalism. So it's not as simple as the black and white international diplomacy makes it. It's actually better than that. So I'm actually fairly optimistic about Yemen. Wouldn't it be great?
Yeah.
I failed after I was
It
there.
would be great, but
went nowhere.
That will bring us to, in a way, to the last question, I hope,
Yeah.
which is because you said like the Houthis, Ansarullah, is not just proxy, Iran proxy, it's like just more like Iranian and more Yemeni nationalistic movement. That will bring us to Hezbollah in Lebanon, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
how do you see?
What's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there? If I don't ask you about Lebanon, I think the Lebanese will be very much disappointed because they're the center of the whole world, you know.
I will be crap. Never mind. Yeah, Lebanon is a tortured country, isn't it? Because of, you know, the way it's set up politically, that whole set of, you know, special places for special people. The state within a state, which is a state more than the state, of course, Hezbollah and so forth. The way it's dragged the people of Lebanon into war, which they don't see as their own war. And so, you know, we know the just strategic disposition, which is dreadful, the people of Lebanon. I was somewhat encouraged by the ceasefire in Lebanon. It's a rare moment to be encouraged by a ceasefire, because I've overseen most ceasefires which never work. So I know the break rate is huge, but I thought it was good. And then I kept hearing about, of course, that, you know, that it's broken every day. There's airstrikes every day. There's still insistence on pushing Hezbollah back, and they're not going back enough beyond the river and whatnot. So it's still in action, isn't it? It's still in process. It ain't there yet. And I think I'll make 2 points. One is I think we really, and you are doing the right thing here, mustn't drift our attention away from Lebanon. You know, Lebanon has told us history about how important its stability and its vivacity is for the region. You know, it plays a special cultural role, which is a modern society. It's an interesting, open society. And Hezbollah has always been, you know, a drag on that. So we go away from it at our peril, us being the region. Secondly, no state, I mean, anywhere in the world, including mine in Wales, should have an organization which is running state services and state administration for a population within the state. I don't have an ideological problem with Hezbollah. I have that problem, however. It is undermining the fundamental democracy aspirations of the state. So, of Lebanon. So the two things come together. This has to be resolved. It's not going to be resolved by, airstrikes from Israel. It has to be resolved through a little bit of discussion. That's why, of course, Syria will play a part. But at the moment, it's an orphan, isn't it? It's not attended to. It's much more important than we think. And it's a beautiful country. It's fantastic, isn't it? It's the gateway to the lovely Syria that we all love.
Hezbollah has been weakened, no?
Yes, and that's a good thing in that sense, isn't it?
Hezbollah has been weakened. Assad regime has been toppled.
Yeah.
Iran, in a way, been like in war with Israel.
Yeah.
So this is the last question. So maybe we both agree that we're not sure if there will be a new Middle East out of this, right? We
No.
were there before. But would you agree that what we've witnessed in the last few months and weeks, that Iran, the first time since 1979, the Iranian influence being dramatically weakened in the whole region?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's a really, really good central question, because it's true. The new Middle East, which we qualified earlier on, is certainly because of that. Powers have changed. The disposition of powers have changed. Iran and its proxies and its armed groups, and including Hamas, not sure that's a proxy of Iran, but whatever, these armed groups have lost power and authority and assets due to the various wars that have been visited upon them and that they have also created. That is not necessarily a bad thing. So it's an opportunity, but it'll only be an opportunity. So it's an opportunity for creating stability in the region, of course, and amity, by the way, in the region. So, it's not your armed group, keep you away from my country and stuff. But it will only be so if the leaderships in these different countries recognizes that we need to understand the reasons for those armed groups. We need to understand the constituencies of those armed groups. And then we deal properly with them in terms of social welfare, in terms of governance, in terms of diplomacy. We are not treating them as pariahs to be simply eliminated, to use that word. It won't work for a start. It's not true, and it's certainly against any concept of mutual stability.
Thank you so much. It's great. Brilliant.
Thank you, Ibrahim.